Okay, just imagine for a second. Think about a world without, say, the alphabet,
Hmm.
where writing is just for a tiny elite, using hundreds of really complex
Hard
symbols.
to picture, really.
Or what if huge parts of the planet just couldn't be farmed? Too dry, maybe too steep?
Right. Or cities without walls. Yeah. Vulnerable.
Exactly. How incredibly different would our world, our whole history, our civilization look?
It's almost impossible to wrap your head around it. Those things feel so foundational.
They really do, and that's exactly what we're digging into today. This deep dive explores a really fascinating source. It looks at the surprising origins of some absolute cornerstones of global civilization.
Things we totally take for granted.
Totally. And this source argues they trace their roots way back to a specific ancient region, ancient Palestine.
Yeah, the material we're looking at lays out several key developments, arguing they either wouldn't exist or, they'd look vastly different without these contributions from that specific area and its people.
So our goal here is simple. Unpack these claims. Stick strictly to the evidence and arguments in this source. We want to get a sense of the potential impact these contributions might have had.
Because, as this source really tried to show, history isn't just one event after another in isolation. It's all interconnected.
Like threads weaving together.
Exactly. And sometimes the most critical threads, the ones shaping global development, start in places you might not expect. It definitely challenges some common assumptions.
Right. Understanding these deeper layers, like this material encourages us to do, it paints a much more complex picture, doesn't it? A more interconnected, maybe even shared human story than we usually hear.
Definitely. So where should we start? What's the first cornerstone this source tackles?
Let's start with maybe the most fundamental building block for knowledge, writing. The source makes a pretty big claim here
Oh.
that the actual idea of an alphabet, it was born in ancient Palestine.
Okay, that's interesting. Because you often hear it credited elsewhere, right? Like later cultures or maybe solely the Egyptians.
Exactly. But this source points specifically to Semitic-speaking Canaanites. In the Levant, that's that eastern Mediterranean coastal region during the Bronze and Iron Ages.
And it gives details, dates.
It does. It mentions things like Proto-Canaanite inscriptions, going back to the 13th, 12th centuries BCE. So yeah, thousands of years before classical Greece or Rome. And then the more developed Phoenician forms appearing around 1050 BCE.
And the source explains why this was such a big deal.
Yeah, it emphasizes how revolutionary it was. See, earlier systems like hieroglyphs or cuneiform, they used hundreds of symbols.
Right, incredibly complex.
But these Canaanite scripts, they use only about 24 symbols. Each one stood for a distinct sound.
Ah, so phonetic. That changes everything for learning it.
Totally. It democratized writing, in a way, and the source says this Phoenician script, which came from those Canaanite roots, spread like wildfire through trade routes, especially around the 9th and 8th centuries BCE.
And that's the script that influenced others.
Critically, yes. According to this material, it was adapted. First into the Greek alphabet, and then later into the Latin one. They even mention Britannica backing this up, saying the Greek alphabet is derived from the Phoenician.
So the Greeks added vowels. That was their innovation. But the basic consonant system.
Came from these earlier Semitic scripts, according to this source. It makes the case that those simple letters, first scratched out by Canaanites, literally underpin every Western alphabet we use today, including the words you're hearing right now.
Wow. And it wasn't just for kings and priests.
Apparently not. They mention this amazing, what's thought to be the oldest complete sentence ever found in this first alphabet. It was on this little ivory comb from Lachish, dated around 1150 BCE.
And what did it say? Something profound.
Huh. Not exactly. It was basically a plea. May this tusk root out the lice of the hair and the beard.
Lice. Okay, so definitely used for everyday concerns.
Right. It shows common use. The source argues, look, without this alphabetic breakthrough, literacy probably stays an elite thing. The flowering of Greek and Roman literature. Delayed, maybe even prevented, the whole global literacy revolution hinges on this, according to their argument.
So it directly counters those other origin stories and puts the roots firmly in ancient Canaan. That's a strong claim.
It is. Okay, let's shift from letters to, food, sustenance. Another absolute cornerstone.
Agriculture.
Yes. This source argues that the Fertile Crescent, specifically including Palestine, was a major birthplace of agriculture, particularly the domestication of key grains like wheat and barley.
And there's evidence for that specific location.
The source points to genetic and archaeological studies. They show farmers in the southern Levant were harvesting wild grains and then starting to domesticate barley and wheat around 10,000 years ago.
10,000 years ago. That's incredibly early.
It really is. And the emphasis here is that these specific crops originated here before they spread out to Europe, Asia, North Africa. It mentions the pre-pottery Neolithic A period that's roughly 10,000 to 9,200 BCE people in this area were already cultivating cereals, maybe even before full domestication happened elsewhere.
Wow. So places like Jericho.
Exactly. Sites like Jericho, Beta. The archaeology shows these early folks relied heavily on wheat, barley, legumes. The source argues, pretty convincingly I think, that without these specific crops emerging here, settled life wouldn't have taken off the way it did.
No villages, no towns.
And the rise of cities, complex civilizations, significantly delayed. It makes the case that our modern diets, especially anything based on Mediterranean grains, would look totally different if not for these breakthroughs right here.
Again, sort of challenging narratives that might focus only on Mesopotamia, for example.
Right. It broadens the picture. And farming here wasn't just about the plants, was it? It was also about managing the land itself.
Especially in a challenging environment. Which brings us to irrigation and terracing, I assume.
You got it. The source really highlights how people in ancient Palestine dealing with arid land and mountains got incredibly clever with water early on.
Like how?
Well, carving channels from springs, digging cisterns to store rainwater, even complex tunnels. It mentions Hezekiah's tunnel in Jerusalem, 8th century BCE, bringing water into the city. Ingenious stuff for the time.
But the terraces are maybe even more visible today, right?
Absolutely. Building those stone walls on hillsides to create flat ledges you could actually farm on. The source points to the terraces at Batir as an amazing example.
Are they still there?
Millennia old, and according to the source, still being farmed today using these intricate traditional irrigation channels fed by local springs. It's incredible longevity.
That's amazing.
And it quotes an anthropologist saying this kind of dryland terrace agriculture developed here in the southern Levant, was among the earliest implementations of a technique that then became common worldwide.
So think about the impact. Suddenly you can farm steep slopes, rocky ground, drier areas.
Land that would otherwise just be barren. The source argues, without these techniques developing here, huge parts of the Middle East and probably beyond might have stayed unfarmable. Reclaiming tough land for farming, that whole concept would have been delayed or maybe just less effective.
No hillside vineyards, fewer irrigated farms in dry zones.
Exactly. The source traces the lineage back here, and it pushes back a bit, noting that while later cultures refined irrigation, these foundational methods date way back to Roman times and even earlier in this specific region.
Okay, so we have writing, farming, managing the land. What about building communities, cities?
Ah, yes. Here, the source makes another really striking claim about urban civilization itself.
Which is?
It presents evidence suggesting one of the world's earliest known urban fortresses is actually in Palestine, potentially predating many cities often cited as the first.
Okay, where are they talking about?
Ancient Jericho. Specifically, the archaeological site Tel es-Sultan. The source talks about these massive stone walls they built there.
How massive and how early?
Get this. Around 8,000 BCE. That's thousands of years before the big Mesopotamian cities we usually think of. And the walls were over 4 meters tall, backed by this huge tower, maybe 8 or 9 meters high.
8,000 BCE. With walls like that, that's truly ancient.
Isn't it? The source even quotes Encyclopedia Britannica calling these structures the earliest technology uncovered that can be ascribed unequivocally to purely military purposes.
So the argument is they basically invented city fortifications.
That's the case the source makes, enabling permanent, defensible settlements. And it argues this was crucial. Protected cities allowed populations to grow, people to specialize their work.
Division of labor, writing, law, all the things that come with cities.
Exactly. The source contends that without this incredibly early innovation in defensive building, the whole urban revolution might have stalled or just looked completely different.
So it directly challenges that cities started in Mesopotamia narrative.
It certainly offers a significant counterpoint, arguing for walled towns millennia earlier, right there in Palestine. The idea of the fortified city, it says, has incredibly deep roots here.
And that skill with stone, it wasn't just walls, was it?
No, not at all. The source also credits the ancient Canaanites of Palestine as being early masters of stone construction in general, architecture.
What kind of evidence does it offer for that?
A really key piece discussed is this discovery at a site called Tel Shimron. They found a well-built stone arch and a vaulted staircase.
An arch. How old?
Middle Bronze Age, so around 1800 BCE. The source presents this as one of the oldest known examples of a true arch found anywhere.
Wow. So long before the Romans, who usually get the credit for popularizing arches.
Exactly. The significance highlighted here is that the basic structural ideas, the arch, the corbelled vault, were understood and being used in this region way earlier. The Romans definitely perfected and spread the round arch, but the source says the roots are here.
And they worked with big stones too, right?
Oh yeah. The source points out builders quarrying and dressing enormous blocks, some over 500 tons, for walls and temples. Thinking of places like Megiddo or, the massive stones in Jerusalem's Western Wall, that allowed for much bigger, stronger buildings.
So the argument is that later architects, Romans, Byzantines,
Hmm.
they were building on this local tradition.
That's the case presented, that this foundational stonecraft developed by Canaanites provided critical precedence. Without this early mastery of stonework and understanding principles like the arch, later Mediterranean architecture would have lacked this crucial lineage.
Just think modern building without arches or vaults. Bridges, domes,
Yeah.
so much would be different or impossible.
Right. The source traces that architectural vocabulary back through these ancient masons. It uses finds like that Tel Shimron arch to counter views, attributing it all to later or maybe distant influences.
Okay, so they built these fortified cities, they had advanced building techniques. How did these places connect to the rest of the world?
Trade and diplomacy. The source emphasizes ancient Palestine's role as a really vital crossroads, a hub.
Makes sense geographically.
For thousands of years, yeah. Caravans, ships, they all funneled through ports like Gaza and Jaffa, that's modern Yaffo. Gaza, for example, at a site called Tel El Ajul, was apparently a key Egyptian administrative center way back in the 16th century BCE.
A strategic point then.
Described in the source as a caravan point of strategic importance, linking Egypt and Syria. And Jaffa, it says, was one of the southern Levant's most important ports, basically since the Bronze Age. Good natural harbor, very valued by different rulers over time.
And what was moving through there?
Goods, for sure. Olives, wine, fabrics. The typical Mediterranean stuff. But just as important, the source stresses, was the flow of ideas connecting Africa, Asia, Europe. Gaza later became a key port for the Nabateans, then a big Roman center, too.
So these Palestinian cities were like engines for the ancient world's networks.
That's the argument, that they were essential nodes. Without them, the source suggests moving goods, tech, even diplomatic messages would have been much slower, more limited. The whole story of global trade, cultural exchange, it would look different.
It offers a perspective that maybe complements or challenges histories that focus only on, say, Phoenician Tyre or the Nile cities.
Exactly. It highlights the independent importance of places like Gaza and Jaffa based on the evidence discussed in this source.
Okay, so we've covered writing, food, building, trade. What about less tangible things? Culture, social fabric.
The source delves into that too. One really interesting point is about the ancient culture of hospitality.
Hospitality.
Yeah. It argues that people there, especially those living in harsh desert conditions, developed this really strong, almost sacred code about welcoming strangers. It was crucial for survival, for community, and it had a huge influence later on.
How so? What did this code involve?
Basically, strict rules about offering food, water, shelter. Access to those things was life or death, right?
Right.
So there was this powerful obligation to protect travelers, anyone seeking refuge.
Is there an example?
Well, the source cites the biblical story of Abraham rushing out to welcome three strangers. It presents this as embodying that deep-rooted Canaanite and Bedouin tradition. The guest gets the absolute best treatment. Refusing help. Unthinkable.
And this influenced later traditions.
Profoundly, according to the source. It argues that famous Arab and Islamic hospitality traditions have much older roots, right here in the ancient Canaanite Bedouin culture of Palestine, predating the Islamic era. It mentions Palestinian folklore and old law codes emphasizing guest rights.
So without this tradition,
The source suggests society would have been colder, more dangerous, especially for travelers, fewer safe havens for pilgrims, traders, refugees throughout history. It calls hospitality a bedrock value of Middle Eastern culture with these really deep historical origins in this land.
that's fascinating. What else on the natural side?
It also highlights as a strong heritage of resistance literature and storytelling.
Resistance literature.
Yeah. The source says that even when facing conquest or exile, people in villages used folk tales, poems, recitations, not just as entertainment, but as a way to inspire people to persevere, to hold on to their identity.
Like an oral tradition keeping culture alive.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It notes modern writers like Mahmoud Darwish or Naomi Shihab Nye draw on this really deep wellspring.
Is there a quote about that?
Yeah, it quotes Nye saying something like, telling a story helped us figure out who we were, where we were in the world. The source sees this as absolutely central to cultural resilience, passing down memory, values, connection to the land, even when people are scattered.
Hmm. And is there a specific concept tied to this?
Yes, it discusses sumun. It means steadfastness or sort of sticking to the land. It's an ethos of survival through ongoing hardship, and it's celebrated in these folk songs and poems.
This literature, this storytelling, it kept people connected.
According to the source, yes. Connected to their history, their homeland. It challenges any view that might dismiss this as not serious as literature, arguing the world would lose a powerful voice of empathy and resilience if this tradition wasn't recognized. A loss for global understanding.
Interesting. Any other cultural elements?
Yes, traditional medicine, herbalism, and especially olive oil.
Ah, olive oil. Still so central there.
Incredibly. The source claims that long before modern medicine, people in ancient Palestine were using local plants and olive oil as remedies, and this knowledge contributed to our global pharmacopoeia.
What kind of plants?
It mentions things like thyme, hyssop, sage plants native to the Levant, and refers to ethnobotanical studies showing villagers today still use these herbs based on ancient lore passed down.
And the olive oil. It's been there forever, hasn't it?
For about 6,000 years, according to the source, growth cultivated that long. Oil was even exported to Egypt way back between 4000 and 3000 BCE.
Wow. And used for medicine.
Yes, not just food. The source highlights its use in medicine and rituals. It even connects this ancient knowledge to modern research, linking high olive oil consumption to health benefits, like lower cancer rates, suggesting ancient people knew something about its anti-inflammatory or antiseptic properties long ago.
So the argument is our collective knowledge of remedies is richer because of this.
Exactly. That humanity's pharmacopoeia owes a debt to the plants and the folk knowledge developed and preserved in this region, particularly within Palestinian communities. It argues this traditional knowledge existed alongside and maybe informed later scholarly traditions, often credited just to Greeks or Romans.
Okay, one last area, perhaps. How did all these different people interact?
Right, the source addresses that directly. Cultural pluralism and coexistence.
Which might sound surprising given modern conflict.
Precisely. The source argues that despite that modern lens, historically, ancient Palestine often saw long periods where different faiths and cultures mingled peacefully.
Where's the evidence for that?
It points to cities like Gaza, Jerusalem, Nablus as historical crossroads. For centuries, you had Jews, Christians, Muslims, and before them, Canaanites, Greco-Romans, all living side by side.
Are there specific examples of this mixing?
Yeah, a fascinating one mentioned is a 5th century synagogue mosaic from Gaza. It shows King David depicted like Orpheus, the Greek mythological figure.
Wow, a blend of Jewish and Greek imagery.
Exactly, illustrating this cultural fusion. The source notes Gaza, for instance, thrived under early Muslim rule with significant coexisting communities of Muslims, Christians, and Jews.
So even with changing rulers.
Agreements were often made to protect minorities. It quotes historian Stephen E. Mulder saying Gaza's archaeology shows the sustaining of pluralistic norms. And this wasn't just cities and towns and farms. There was intermarriage, shared festivals.
Why is highlighting this important, according to the source?
Because, it argues, overlooking this history feeds into simplistic clash of civilizations narratives. It challenges the idea that the region was always monocultural or defined purely by conflict.
It suggests there's a lost model of tolerance there.
A historical model, yes. It argues this history offers templates for finding common ground, even pointing to examples like crusaders keeping church elements when converting buildings to mosques. Remembering this legacy, the source implies, offers lessons for today.
So if we pull all these different threads together, the alphabet, farming, building, trade, culture, coexistence, what's the big picture the source is painting?
I think it's making a really powerful case that these aren't just isolated factoids. They are truly fundamental elements of civilization.
The alphabet, grain agriculture, irrigation, city walls, the arch, trade routes, hospitality, storytelling, medicine,
Exactly. And according to this material, they either originated or saw crucial early development in ancient Palestine,
and then spread out, influencing the whole world.
becoming deeply woven into the fabric of global civilization, adapted, built upon, but ultimately underpinning so much of what we just take for granted today.
So back to that what-if question from the beginning.
Right. This source really forces you to consider how profoundly different our world might be without these specific contributions it attributes to this region. The words you read, the food on your table, the buildings around you, even some deep cultural values.
Understanding this history, as the source presents it, it gives you a much deeper, more, well, nuanced view of how things developed.
It really does. It shows how innovations from one specific place, maybe a place sometimes overlooked in the grand narratives, can have these massive global lasting effects.
It definitely challenges those simpler stories and underlines how interconnected human development really is, across cultures, across time.
So maybe the profound message here, based on this source material, is about recognizing that complexity.
I think so. That the foundations of global civilization weren't built in just one place by one people. They're a tapestry, woven from diverse contributions from many, many corners of the ancient world.
And recognizing these diverse roots, especially those sometimes overlooked, gives us a much richer and maybe more accurate picture of our shared human history.
Yeah, it underscores how much we might owe to innovations from landscapes and peoples whose full historical impact isn't always acknowledged or is sometimes attributed elsewhere.
Well, we've certainly taken a deep dive into a really thought-provoking perspective
Yeah.
today. We've looked at claims from the source that highlight ancient Palestine's role in developing things as absolutely fundamental as the alphabet, cities, farming, architecture, trade, and these very human traditions of hospitality and resilience.
It's a lot to take in. These elements discussed in the source are incredibly foundational.
They really are. And considering how deeply, according to the source, they've shaped writing, food, cities, building, trade, culture right across the globe, it kind of leaves you wondering, doesn't it?
Rendering what?
Well, what other critical, maybe hidden roots of our modern world are still waiting there, waiting to be discovered or maybe just acknowledged in the historical landscapes of regions we tend to view only through the lens of today's news? What happens when we really look past the headlines, down into that incredibly deep history lying beneath?